If you fly with any frequency at all, you've been impacted by a flight cancellation or delay. You've probably even had to pay a surprise fee for a service that you mistakenly thought was included in your ticket price too. But recently, a new set of rules have been introduced by the US Department of Transport, or DOT for short. These rules are intended to give passengers more rights when it comes to dealing with this kind of thing. But surprisingly, most major US airlines are suing the government over these rules, even though they barely scratch the surface of flight protections offered in other countries. And in this video, we'll break down the new rules, compare them to Europe's stronger standards, and reveal why airlines are up in arms. I mean, knowing your passenger rights is really a must for any traveler. I've been paid compensation of more than $600 for flights that cost me $400 simply because they had a long delay or were canceled and I knew my rights. And every time airlines have lost my check bag, I've always been able to go to the store and get everything I need until it was recovered at the expense of the airline. And although these new US rules do differ a bit from others in place around the world, understanding your rights when flying in the US is a must for every savvy traveler. So let's dive straight into these shiny new US rules that are apparently exciting enough to sue over. One of the main ideas in this new set of rules from the DOT is to clarify your right to a refund in case of a canceled or significantly changed flight. And as the DOT puts it, these new rules define the meaning of significant change for the first time ever. So basically this covers quite a few different things that could happen when you have a flight booked. First off, any change in departure or arrival time of more than 3 hours for domestic flights and 6 hours on international flights is covered. And this seems not only to apply to long delays at the airport, but also schedule changes where your flight is changed to be significantly earlier. And then it's also considered a significant change if flights are moved to or from a different airport, if the number of layovers is increased, if a passenger is downgraded to a lower class of service, or if a layover is moved to a different airport, or a flight is moved to an aircraft that is less accessible or accommodating to a person with a disability. And on top of that, these rules cover significantly delayed baggage and extra services that are booked that aren't actually provided. So if a checked bag is not received within 12 hours of a domestic flight arriving, or between 15 and 30 hours of an international flight arriving, a refund for any checked bag fees you paid will now become your right. And hypothetically, any extra service fee you pay for a service that's not actually included should be refunded. Plus, the new rules make it clear that any refunds you're owed must be issued back to the original method of payment or in cash automatically. And on top of that, refunds should be processed within 7 days for credit card transactions and 20 days for any other type of transaction. So in a nutshell, these rules require airlines to give refunds that they probably already should have been giving anyway, and to do so automatically. In addition to the improvement these rules will bring to the refund situation in the US, they also include strict requirements for airlines and any business selling airline tickets to be upfront about baggage fees and any fees to change or cancel a ticket. I mean, how many times have you found what seemed like a great deal only to discover later in the booking process that the full-size carry-on or checked bag that you need costs like $100 more? Stating these kinds of annoying fees upfront seems like a really passenger-friendly thing to do. And I really don't think the DOT is necessarily wrong when they call these fees bait and switch, at least in many cases. But a bunch of airlines in the US don't seem to agree at all because they're suing the government over this. But we'll look at this more in detail later in the video. First, let's take a look at a similar set of rules that are already in place in Europe and how they compare. In contrast to the US, much of Europe has a set of regulations that require airlines to give you cold hard cash when they mess up. Well, technically they pay you via bank transfer, but you get what I mean. This set of rules is known as EU 261, or really Regulation EC number 261/2004, but we can just call it EU 261. The main part of EU 261 that I find really interesting is that you're entitled as a passenger to between 250 and 600 euros in compensation when a flight is significantly delayed or cancelled. But it is really important to keep in mind that this only applies to flights departing from or arriving to the EU on EU carriers or departing from the EU on non-EU carriers. And then there are some more details to it. For example, airlines can avoid paying out EU 261 compensation if they notify you of a significant delay or cancellation with at least 2 weeks' notice. But what I find really important to understand here is that this cash compensation is entirely separate from any refunds or transportation provided. Meaning a passenger with a valid flight interruption is still entitled to transportation to their destination or a refund in addition to compensation. And I was really hoping the US Department of Transportation would take a hint from EU 261 here and include compensation in their new set of rules. But that doesn't seem to be the case, at least not yet. But the DOT did mention that they're pursuing further rulemakings that will require airlines to provide compensation and amenities when they cause flight delays or cancellations. So I'm eagerly waiting to see what happens here. I mean, compensation for your time and inconvenience really creates some nice incentive for airlines to operate as on time as they can. And obviously, knowing when to claim EU 261 can really get you a significant amount of compensation. And that is compensation you deserve. It's not like you can choose to be impacted or not by airlines' mistakes. Even if you sit out your super long delay in a nice airport lounge and still take your delayed flight, it's not your fault the airline messed up, and you certainly shouldn't feel guilty about spending that time in the lounge. And even if you didn't have lounge access to wait out that delay, EU 261 requires airlines to provide passengers with drinks and food during long delays. I have found that just like all your other rights under EU 261, you do generally have to ask for this proactively. But if you don't know, you'll never ask, right? Now for me, the big issue with EU 261 is that most people don't even realize when they can claim it. In fact, somewhere around a whopping 90% of passengers that could claim EU 261 compensation never make a claim. And that's where the new DOT rules in the US actually are quite impressive. Rather than just changing the rules so that they could benefit passengers when passengers decide to take their own initiative, the new DOT rules are intended to require everything to happen automatically. But unfortunately, for the time being, everything does not include cash compensation. Now you might say, well, if that 90% of passengers would automatically receive compensation from the airline, then all the airlines would either go bankrupt or just raise their fares a lot. But the truth is that major airlines that are typically against passenger-friendly regulations have pretty massive profit margins and are just lobbying to avoid paying anything extra. And as for raising ticket prices, Europe has seen airlines like Ryanair try to tack on a fee that is supposed to make up for the cost of EU 261 compensation. But if you really look into the details, the cost of compensating passengers when the airlines messed up is just a necessary cost of business, and airline profits for the airlines that are most impacted by EU 261 are doing just fine. But with EU 261, it's important to keep in mind that the idea here is that airlines will avoid unnecessary delays and cancellations wherever possible. Necessary delays and cancellations due to stuff like weather or air traffic control don't require compensation. So all in all, EU 261 seems pretty fair to airlines when you really consider it. And nobody wants to live somewhere where flights are randomly delayed and canceled to the extent that you can't even really rely on them. And it's also relevant to consider that all US airlines that operate in Europe have to pay out EU 261 compensation too. And they're still operating plenty of flights to and from Europe and are oftentimes offering very competitive pricing to fly across the Atlantic too. But let's talk about US airlines a little bit more now. American, Alaska, United, JetBlue, Hawaiian, and Delta are all participating in a lawsuit that argues that the DOT has gone way beyond its authority in announcing these new rules. The lawsuit seems to focus solely on the part of the new rules that will require airlines to disclose all of their extra fees up front. In the lawsuit, this part of the new set of rules are called arbitrary, capricious, and it claims that disclosing these fees will somehow confuse customers rather than help them comparison shop. In contrast, the DOT has made it clear that the upfront disclosure of extra fees will actually help consumers save a significant amount of money by being able to comparison shop without having to search around for the cost of fees on different parts of the airline's website. I can only imagine how much of a fuss the airlines would have put up if the DOT had added additional compensation requirements like what are found in EU 261. But notably, Southwest Airlines is not a part of the lawsuit, as they've made it clear that they're essentially already compliant with these fee disclosure requirements. I must say I don't fly Southwest that often, but the fact that they always include 2 free check bags and don't charge any change or cancellation fees is definitely helping them out there. Still, the lawsuit has called the fee disclosure part of the rules a bad solution in search of a problem. But if you've ever tried to book a flight on a low-cost carrier, Spirit, Frontier, you know that there kind of is a problem when it comes to these fees. Well, to be fair, maybe not everyone sees it as a problem. But I think that we can all agree that it's a little annoying when it comes to searching for flight deals. Often it would take a significant amount of time just to compare the cost of booking the bare bones fare and adding baggage or whatever other extras you need against booking a bundle. And the prices of adding anything after you actually book can be much, much more. But the airlines participating in this lawsuit aren't really the worst offenders when it comes to fees, at least in my view. So it does feel a bit like these airlines just don't want to be told what to do. That is, unless the government is telling them to take billions of dollars in taxpayer money as a bailout the next time they deem themselves in trouble. And while those airlines fight this new regulation in court, it's worth considering how they might impact another common practice in the US, goodwill compensation. Another reality of flying on most US airlines is that when you have a bad flight experience, a big delay, onboard issues, or really anything, complaining to the airline has usually been a pretty successful way to get some compensation. Airlines often like to call this compensation a goodwill gesture. So with all these changes, it will be interesting to see to what degree goodwill compensation changes, if at all. The new DOT rules are certainly another talking point airlines could use if they want to avoid paying out compensation. But at the same time, nearly all goodwill compensation is given out in the form of vouchers or airline miles. And neither one of those currencies really cost the airline that much, especially when compared to cash compensation. Some of the mileage currencies in the US still carry expiration dates, and pretty much all airline vouchers have expiration dates too. So the chances of someone not even using their goodwill compensation reduces costs even further. I must say though that I don't find goodwill compensation to be all that common outside of North America. And given that it's a pretty common practice in the US across the board, even outside of the aviation industry, I bet goodwill compensation will keep being commonplace no matter what. And one other aspect to the new DOT rules in comparison with other passenger rights regulations is the importance of aviation in the US. These rules are especially needed in the US because unlike in much of Europe, ground transportation between cities is often poorly served or even non-existent if you don't have a car. Basically, flying is the only good option to get around much of the US. So if you're in Asia or Europe and your flight is canceled, you likely have other good transportation options. But in the US, this isn't really the case. I mean, aviation in the US serves the role that public transport plays in many other parts of the world. So why not hold it to standards that would benefit the public? I don't think anybody would really find this airline backlash against pro-passenger rules to be that surprising, but it is kind of absurd given the functions airlines are supposed to have, especially in the US. And I mean, EU 261 is a really good example of some rules that could benefit aviation in any part of the world. But at the same time, if you go visit Japan, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any particular rules to protect passengers that compare to the new DOT rules or EU 261. Yet likely due to the culture in Japan, flights are rarely delayed or cancelled. And when they are, the major airlines offer refunds, rerouting, and are mostly reasonable. So as I see it, these new DOT rules are one of many solutions to what until now has been a pretty anti-passenger environment in US aviation. And while it's great to see some help is already on the way, it will be really interesting to see if the DOT does try to introduce some new rules requiring compensation. But that's just my 2 cents, and we'd be interested to know what you think too. Are the new DOT rules good enough? Is the DOT wrong to be introducing new rules? Or do you think the new DOT rules fall short of what passenger rights should be? Let us know in the comments. But if anything's for sure here, it's that knowing your rights when the airlines mess up is one of the most important things to know as a passenger. And as we've seen with these new US rules and EU 261, your rights can differ greatly depending on where you're traveling in the world. And with that in mind, I'll be going more in depth on EU 261 and a number of other passenger protection regulations around the world in another video. So once that video is out, I'll drop a link in the description for you. And in addition to these kind of informational videos, I've been documenting my travel experiences around the world to give you a little more inspiration and insight beyond the airport. So definitely give some of those videos a watch too if you haven't yet. Thanks so much for watching, and if you got some value out of this video, do make sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for many more travel videos.